Wes Anderson, in many of his movies, uses a technique I like to call Life in the Dollhouse. In many of Anderson's films, such as the Darjeeling Limited, the Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, the Royal Tenenbaums, and Moonrise Kingdom, all utilize this effect to varying degrees of success. Anderson takes the main settings of his films and condenses them to the size of a dollhouse. He takes a scalpel and cuts his settings in half so we can see into everyone's private residences and, by extension, their thoughts at the same time. And then we are left to consider the whole with that much more understanding of the characters.
Where will we be? On a spaceship somewhere, sailing across an empty sea. This time tomorrow, what will we know?
In my personal favorite of Anderson's repertoire, the Royal Tenenbaums, he introduces us to the entirety of the Tenenbaum family without so much as starting a story. The viewer is taken through each of the individual Tenenbaum children's rooms, which give a detailed history of each child's eccentricities and distastes. Watch as Anderson's detailed lens takes us through each of the characters' histories and sets up the relationships that will be explored throughout the film. The children even wear the same outfits they were seen in as children. This exploration of the Tenenbaum household sets up the entirety of the film. It sets up the characters' relationships, interests, successes, and failures. Anderson takes the time to analyze the setting of his film in order for us to better understand the history and intricacies of the entirety of the Tenenbaum family, rather than just throwing us into the narrative. Anderson, then, uses the same dollhouse effect to explore the setting of the Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. Here, instead of giving an intimate glance into the lives of his characters, he instead lays out the labyrinth and complicated setting of the Belafonte, the long-range sub-hunter that Zissou and his crew use throughout the film to chase the infamous jaguar shark that killed one of his best friends. Anderson uses his dollhouse aesthetic to instead inform the viewer of where they will be spending the majority of the film, and instead of creating a detailed character web, it instead sets the stage as if it's a production for the theater. This allows the viewer to subconsciously have a map of the film, so they can follow the characters without having to actually think about where they are in the ship. Which is in direct contrast to the Royal Tenenbaums, which was actually just a character web introduction, compared to just this map laying out of the setting. After the Royal Tenenbaums and the Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, Anderson later combined the two aesthetics of his dollhouse explorations in the Darjeeling Limited, where later in the film he uses a segmented train car to explore the fates of the people that the three brothers have encountered throughout the film, as well as people who have significant importance to who they are and who they are looking to become. Here he learns from his previous two uses of the technique, rather than at the beginning of the film. He lays out the setting of the film and its various locales by going back through all of the important events of the film, all in the format of the main setting, a segmented train car. He combines the aesthetic of laying out the setting seen on the Belafonte with the emotional depth found in the Tenenbaum household, thus moving forward towards a more perfected type of dollhouse technique. However, his most educated and thoughtful use of the dollhouse technique comes in Moonrise Kingdom, where we see his experience with the technique culminate in the opening sequence. We again get the start of a story, except this time purely through visual. There is no introduction or previous information to go off of, as we found in the Royal Tenenbaums or in the Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou with the two narrators. No overarching narrative in this first introduction, except for the sounds of a record Susie's three younger brothers put on, called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Anderson gives no spoken introductions for his characters and relies on the visuals alone, like in the Darjeeling Limited, but without the context. Instead, we get all the information of the family dynamic through this opening with no actual speaking and just visuals. You see parents who are busy doing their own separate thing, not interacting with each other or their children. Instead, the three young boys are left to entertain themselves with educational records, games like jacks, and flying their model airplanes around, while the older sister appears estranged. She constantly looking for something in the distance, longing for a break in the oppressive isolations of her household through the eyes of her binoculars, the stiff tensions between each of her parents and herself, Without so much as a single word, Anderson perfects his dollhouse effect to show us the true use of this technique, to introduce his characters without ever having to explain anything. Providing a moving story and introduction while continuing the storybook-like feeling of his narratives, Anderson truly has figured out his dollhouse aesthetic with this film, and shows us the true depth that longing can bring in his character, Susie. And that's his life in a dollhouse, his characters being seen with microscopic attention to detail to provide a beautiful, multifaceted portrait of families and settings.